Okay, so we've had a great afternoon, great morning so far, and now we're able to ask all those questions that you didn't get to ask yet. So, anybody want to start? Oh, quiet. And we have two Oprahs running around the room, Jamie and Carolyn.
Again, when it comes to animals, why? Why do they feel the need to continually get them? And even when you go in and try to explain and educate them, and they even understand that collecting animals is not helpful to them or to anyone, especially not to the animals, why do they continue to go back to it? How can I get them the help that they need when there's nothing available in at least a 100-mile radius of my county?
Yeah, let me respond to that one. Animal hoarding is much farther away in terms of developing some kind of effective intervention. There are a couple of parts to your question. One is why, and one is what do I do? The why question, let me tell you a little bit about what we know. One of the characteristics that we see in the lives of people who develop animal hoarding is chaos early in life. During childhood, we see a lot of neglect, and a lot of abuse, and a lot of just general chaos in terms of child care. Let me give you an example. One of the studies we did, we've done several studies of animal hoarding where we interviewed people who have sort of come through it, well, at least it's to some degree. And one of the people I interviewed was a woman who grew up with a sister, and when she was young, on Saturday night, her parents would load them up in the car. They would go to town to a tavern. The two girls would be left in the car. These are young kids. Parents were in the tavern. At the end of the evening, after a night of drinking, they'd come out, each with a new partner, and they'd all go home. And that kind of chaos, it's characteristic. And so we think that animal hoarding is more closely associated with some kind of attachment disorder. It's a little bit like having grown up in an orphanage, almost, without having that kind of parental bonding that attaches people to other people in a way that's not quite the same with people who hoard objects. So, and then what seems to grow out of that is a deficit in mentalization. Now, what I mean by mentalization is the ability to imagine or to empathize with the experience of others. Now, that includes other people and animals. So what happens is the animals become kind of a stimulus for their own kind of fantasy about, and they don't really recognize, they can't understand the experience of the animal, so they kind of make it up as they go. So that's why they're saying, well, this animal loves me and knows I love them, and doesn't, the fact that they're dying or suffering doesn't register because I can't imagine what that animal's really feeling. I'm just sort of projecting onto the animal what's going on. There are some attempts to try to deal with this. Of course, the animals end up getting taken away, but it's really developing trust with someone who can spend time with this person to get to know them and kind of gradually wean them away from the animals. We have seen people able to do it. We have seen people on the other side, and there's sometimes something that clicks with them, and they realize, like this person in the book who I described earlier. She said, I realized that I just didn't care for the animals. I was not taking care of them. But in her mind, they represented what she called pure love. And that was sort of a projection on her part. And, animals are kind of like that. They have this unconditional positive regard for their owner, and that's the kind of thing that they kind of capitalize on. How do you go about finding help for them? Here you need to find someone who works in the sort of animal world. There's a woman, Jane Nathanson, in Boston, who does a lot of this work. And she develops a relationship with them and works with them on the notion of giving up some of their animals, some of that attachment. But it's a long, hard road. It's much harder to deal with than object hoarding, as you probably know.
If I can add something too, I think that along the lines of something you've heard a few times today, the term harm reduction, the idea that maybe that person doesn't have to let all of them go, but most of them.
had the ban lifted from her to allow her to keep, once I started doing my position back in 2008, I went in front of the judge and got the ban lifted and allowed her to keep 2 of the animals. I have done everything that I can to keep this woman out of jail. This is the 5th violation of the court order that I will be writing because we did have to put a limit on her. 6 hamsters turned into 32 in a week because they were, I mean, it just gets worse and worse. And I can't, part of her court ordered was counseling, but there's nobody in our area that handles anything that's even remotely close to her. But there is, after talking to her, again, I've been dealing with her for 7 years now. I know some of her past. I know that a lot of it comes from her childhood, from being abandoned from her mom and being abused and those kind of things. And I'm trying to get her to understand that she needs to talk about those things. But right now, she's over the limit of the animals. I didn't take them. I let her try to rehome them before we were doing it. So I am trying to think outside the box, but I'm running out of options to give the judge to give to her. And that's one of the reasons why I'm here today, is specifically for this woman, is to find another alternative before I have to stand in front of the judge and they put the cuffs on her to lock her up, because I don't think she belongs in jail.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to keep her out of jail.
Yeah, it would be a great opportunity for someone, a therapist, psychologist, social worker, counselor, to take on a case like this, because you really do learn a lot. It's pretty challenging work, but it really is valuable when you make some progress.
You're in, I was going to say, you're in Cumberland, right? Is there anybody from Cumberland here?
In hoarding disorders for New Jersey. So if you go on the Hoarding Disorder Institute, they have like a link that you can click on, and it'll give you all the specialists for New Jersey. I did find that a lot of the specialists are people who work out of nursing homes. I guess a lot of times that's the age that people find that they have a disorder, because they're leaving their home and going to a nursing home. But there's a list of anyone in New Jersey by county on there.
Yeah, the International OCD Foundation has a therapist finder for any place in the country, and it'll find therapists within 20-mile radius, and the therapists on their website indicate whether they treat hoarding or not.
Yes.
Yeah, Dr. Frost, you've been incredibly helpful in creating a framework around hoarding. As you enter your, I guess, 25th year now of addressing this issue, what are you seeing is still sort of a shifting sand where you're still developing, or you feel like is sort of the cutting edge for you in your understanding of hoarding? And then for the whole panel, what are you all most excited about that's happening in this area in terms of research and so on and so forth?
That's a great question. There are a lot of areas that are open for research, and I talked about some of them. This link with PTSD, I think, is fascinating, and if we can solve that, if indeed this is a coping mechanism to cope with PTSD-like symptoms, that is a great place for people to do research. Excuse me. Also, the nature of the attachments that we see. We just started doing some research looking at these rationales people use, and it looks like this fear of waste is coming up as a really important one. Sense of responsibility, a responsibility to the environment, responsibility to the community, and so forth, which is an interesting part of it. And also the sentimental attachments, this anthropomorphism stuff, we just started some research on that. That's fascinating. And there's also something brand new, and there's really only one study that suggested this, but I've been talking with some people about the possibility of looking at this, and that is, I think there may be some kind of circadian disruption in hoarding, and that there may be some kind of disruption not only in the sleeping cycle, but in the waking cycle. So all of us have a kind of regular schedule that we fall into every day in terms of having a meal. There are markers for the day, having a breakfast, for instance, getting up, doing a routine in the morning, having lunch at a particular time, seeing the sun at a particular time every day. And it looks like that may be different for people who suffer from this disorder. And maybe that's another place we can find where to intervene, another kind of, in a way, it may produce or at least decrease people's ability to deal with stress. So those are some of the areas that I think are promising.
Great. Christine?
I was just wondering, at the beginning, when you can't help somebody and they won't get treatment, and they're in fear of losing their home and endangering the people around them, is hospitalization ever a beneficial treatment to engage?
For me, I would wonder what the hospitalization is for, what they're trying to provide. Are they just trying to have the person out of the way so that a clean out can happen? And
No. Maybe medication or trying to get them engaged to start the process.
Okay, so it's a psychiatric stay.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think that there are a lot of alternatives. Some people will choose a clinical setting for something like that. Other ways, there are respite homes that some mental health agencies help to support. Maybe staying at a friend's house, being out of that environment and making a game plan with support. Sometimes it's just being out of that environment to clear your head and work on it, because it sounds like it's a person who wants to work on it. Medication doesn't necessarily mean hospitalization, and working with a provider who can look at what you're taking and why, and do that safely and support you is good. Some people will choose what they might consider the safety and security of a hospital for something like that, but in my experience, there are a lot of alternatives that provide a lot more freedom during that time of crisis.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are a couple of places in the country, and only a couple of places in the country, where a hospitalization for this problem would be beneficial, I think. Just a regular psychiatric stay, unless they're working on something related to the hoarding, is probably not going to be beneficial. I know the OCD Institute in Boston sometimes has hoarding clients come in, but they have a program for them, and it's focused on the hoarding. Just getting them out, if they don't recognize the problem, that's an additional difficulty. And of course, for this problem, you're not going to get someone involuntarily committed, because there's no lack of control there, really, that would lead to a forced psychiatric hospitalization.
She's on her way that way, so
Okay.
go ahead.
Can you speak to the American values as they relate to the hoarding? Is all the focus on possessions and instant gratification any piece of this?
We've done a little bit of research on materialism and hoarding. And materialism is correlated with hoarding, but it's a relatively small correlation. So it doesn't really explain much of it. I think, I don't know what you guys would say, but I suspect that any culture where there's a large number of easily accessible and relatively inexpensive things is likely to have more of a hoarding problem. We've seen it all over the world. So I'm not sure how much the culture contributes to it.
I would tend to agree. Yeah.
Jamie.
We had a case where we discovered a few weeks into knowing a client that she was a hoarder, but she had been living with her daughter, and she had a close relationship with her son, who were also involved in the process of Sandy disaster case management. And when we discovered she was a hoarder, we were kind of very surprised that her children never told us anything about it when they had been so involved in the case itself. At that point, how would you advise us? Would you advise someone to try to talk to the children in a separate entity away from the mother, or how would you handle that? Because we were always surprised by that.
I think if we're asking, the dual roles issue came up earlier. If they're actually in a role where they're providing support for their mom and also related, I would look for a separation between the two. So allow other people to come in and provide some structure, and then talk about how the kids could support that process, and her, maybe, but to sort of recuse themselves from the case if that's the situation.
Yeah, families can be really complicated, right? Because sometimes our experience at least, is that sometimes what the family wants or needs is very different than what our clients want or need. When we have worked with families, we've worked usually with two of us on case managers in those situations, because it's a lot more feelings and emotions and dynamics going on. And so what we've done is had one person working directly with the parent, and then had one person kind of talking through as a liaison almost with the adult children, and then trying to also have conversations together, so people can talk about their concerns or talk about a game plan, but kind of really respecting the primary client, the resident's right to control who knows what and who's talking about it, because our experience is that people have so little control in those kinds of situations that when we can give them some level of control and help them weigh the pros and cons and make good decisions about who's involved with those conversations, it can be helpful. So,
Carolyn.
Rebecca, did you notice or witness any kind of backsliding when Lee was attempting to get himself organized, 2 steps forward and 3 steps back?
Absolutely. And I think I knew that would be part of it going in because of my experience in the mental health world. So I knew it wasn't just going to be, we're going to hop on this smooth sailing boat ride and it's all going to be better soon. I have to say that I accepted that fact that there would be these backslides at the start of our process. And that was key, that acceptance of, I know we're going to slip because I've seen all kinds of recovery around me in my life. And I know that's part of the process, but not allowing that to destroy the process was the vital thing that we did. We held on to it and we said, okay, we're in a fresh moment now. We're not going to talk about the badness of last week. Yes, it's a new day. And I think we had a lot of new days as we were going along in this recovery process.
Yeah, there was one specific example that comes to mind where Becca was supportive when one of these situations happened. I went about 3 years without going to a yard sale because I was so vulnerable to acquiring things. And then, we came around and we're like, yeah, we could go. Let's think of a couple of things that we actually need and go treasure hunt and find them. So we did. It was successful. We found what we wanted. And then we were out the following weekend, and I picked up a couple of things that I really didn't need that day. There was an electric boat motor. There were some art supply organizers. And I hadn't intended to get those things that day. They were not a part of the plan. So we talked, and it was like, yeah, that happened. And what are we going to do? And so Becca was supportive. She wasn't angry at me, but the self-awareness was there, that I recognized that I had just done that thing again. So I was able to stop it and turn it around. And eventually I did use the art organizers, and I gave the boat motor to my brother-in-law because he does have a boat.
We didn't have a boat.
The mice ate holes in it. But that's because it wasn't stored properly. But yeah, we saw it happening in real time instead of saying, wow, this went for a month. Wow, this went for an afternoon. Mm-hmm. So the backslides it's like 2 steps forward, like a hop, skip, jump back, and then keep going.
Okay. This is for the whole panel. So you have 1 or 2 people in here in the room that are from a county and they're very interested in starting this. They see it's an important thing. They see it's happening in their community, yet they don't. They know that it's not part of their job description, as Jesse had referred to before. So how do they really kind of get people to buy into this whole idea and form a coalition in their communities?
I know one of the arguments that I made when we started our program, and I work with task forces all over the country, and I hear a lot is people saying to the folks above them, what we're doing isn't working, right? Because if all of us had the solutions and stuff, we wouldn't be sitting here having a conversation about it. And so starting that and just saying, can we have a small working group, not asking for tons of staffing or anything like that, but just pull together a few meetings. And then from there, collect data. One of the ways we were able to argue for going from I get an hour and a half or 2 hours of staff time to try and work with a couple of people to now having 2 full-time staff positions was collecting data. Even if we couldn't help everybody who was referred to us, we were still able to say we got 292 referrals between this time for over the past year or whatever, and here are the kinds of things that consistently come up from that. Here are the outcomes from those cases. We know half of them were evicted or whatever it is, because then you start to be able to make the right argument to the right people about why you need to change your resources, why you need access to training, and why eventually you need staff positions. Because the reality, kind of thinking about your question about kind of where are we going, you know, eventually, and where are the hopes, is one of the things that we know is that, as Dr. Frost said earlier, mental health clinicians can't do it all. And we've got a situation now where the enforcement community is starting to be open to doing business differently, and now we need the social service community to step up so that we have more boots on the ground doing some of the work, because that's one of the real gaps. And so by collecting the data and kind of slowly inching your way along in those arguments, you can start to build capacity in the right ways and bring the right people along, from my perspective.
And some of the data to collect is data on cost, because some of these cases are up in the $50,000, $60,000 range. And so one case like that, and you've got ammunition to convince the powers that be that something needs to happen differently.
Yeah, sort of an initiative I'm working on in Massachusetts right now is to get these finder-keeper workshops going locally for people, because there are no support options. So I had this idea, you know, put together a letter asking for letters of support for a peer support group for people with clutter issues. And I sent out through all of our networks, so to Mass Housing, mental health, everything, asked everybody, you know, I don't even know who to address this to, but generally to whom this may concern. You know, how has this affected people that you work with, and how might it be helpful? And so I received letters of support from the Commission on Deaf and Hard of Hearing, the Elder Services, mental health, from the housing, and from all different branches of mental health human services, and then was able to approach the Department of Mental Health and say, there's all this, you know, support for an initiative like this. What can we do? And can you fund some small training so that I can bring this out there to the community and they can start the groups themselves? Where are the places that are equipped? And I thought, you know what, we've got a lot of peer mentors working in mental health agencies right now. I want to hold these free conferences, and the only obligation is that these agencies send 2 people that they will allow to run this group 1 hour a week out of their week. That's it. And so I know that we're now going to have groups out in Western Mass. The first of these trainings is next Friday. And it's a little bit of support from here, a little bit of support there. And then you leave, and when you leave, there are new groups happening. So there are so many ways to make it happen.
And for me, from the personal perspective, I think it's really vital to know that we can take on a new mindset. This is not a lost cause. People can recover, people can change. I think it's about reducing the stigma and having people show that it's not as rare as people think. Because we've said everyone we talk to can just list off all these people they know. And I think showing people that they can have hope, and this is not a dead end. We can make progress here. I think it's really important for people to know that hope is worthwhile, and to have a high regard for the ability and resilience of people to change.
Any other questions?
I have a question for the whole panel. The terminology of the word hoarders. I know that it's used in TV shows. I know that it's used colloquially. Through mental health, oftentimes we say that, you know, specifically saying, you know, schizophrenics or addicts, we want to avoid that terminology. Do you feel that that terminology is something that's appropriate to use in this case, because it makes individuals feel like they're part of something that's not just them isolated alone? Or do you feel that utilizing a different type of terminology is best when talking to people that are coping with that issue?
Mm-hmm. Who wants to go first?
I will go first.
All right.
I will go first unexpectedly. I worked with children with autism spectrum disorder for about a decade. And instead of saying I work with autistic kids, I find it much more valuable to say I work with children who experience autism spectrum disorder. They are not their disorder. They are people who are affected in these ways, but that is not an adjective to use for, I don't refer to them that way. And the same thing with hoarders. We like to use finders keepers. Hoarders doesn't feel very good, personally.
I would say that it really depends on the audience too. I definitely support people in referring to themselves using whatever language makes sense to them. People will call themselves a hoarder, but I probably won't call them a hoarder. I tend to call myself a finder keeper, a collector. If I'm talking with someone that relates on a certain level, I'll say, I've been struggling with hoarding disorder. Whatever I feel is going to help me connect with the person or people I'm talking to. So I don't have any one word I use instead of others, but I don't, again, like Becca said, I don't call people schizophrenic, or something like that. It might be a person diagnosed with schizophrenia, a person living with schizophrenia, a person living with hoarding disorder, who's working on reducing their clutter. I'm a finder keeper. I find stuff, I keep it. Pretty descriptive. So I can own that because that's true. But again, a layer of that expression too is that some people are still finding, but they're able to let it go. Some people are still keeping, but they're not bringing it in, right? So everybody's dealing with a different part of the equation too. So I try to be specific.
I tend to use the language, I mirror the language used by my clients and how they refer to themselves. I feel like it's one of those things that doesn't ask a lot for me if they're see themselves as a collector, even if I don't see their collections in the same way that they do. It's not really costing me much to do that, and it does a lot for them. I similarly tend to talk about people with hoarding disorder or something along those lines with clutter struggles rather than labeling people because the clients that I have, just as these folks have said, have a rich way of identifying that's not about their clutter problem, it's about all of the different parts of themselves. So,
I think it's telling that in all of our presentations, none of us use the term hoarder. And I think we've all gotten to that point where we try to avoid person-centered language. And the person is not the disorder. The person is not the behavior. It's maybe a person struggling with hoarding or struggling with keeping or struggling with acquisition, but it's not, that doesn't define the person. And so from my perspective, I try not to use that language. And this is a progression. I mean, when I started doing research, I used that term even in some of the writings. But I've sort of evolved away from using that kind of language. I think many people find it pejorative, and for that reason, it's worth not using the word.
If you want to know why that can be so hurtful, it often comes back to the people that are using it. Matt Paxton, Opie and Anthony on YouTube, there's an interview for you. There's someone using the word hoarder that's hurting feelings, and I'll let him speak for himself. But I'm waiting for the day when someone raises their hand and says, we don't call ourselves finder keepers, we find it offensive. I was like, okay, so what are we calling ourselves now? So that will continue to change. Language is fluid. And so as long as we're being strengths-based and we're not being insulting deliberately to people, then maybe we won't be insulting accidentally either.
Okay. Carolyn?
Lee and Becca, what was your process like in downsizing? And I find with myself trying to sort through stuff, I have to put it all back again because I don't have the space to keep it or whatever. So what was your process in doing that when you have a cramped space? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Do any of you remember those little handheld square puzzles with all the squares, the numbers that you needed to move around in order to get one in the right place? You had to discombobble the rest of it. It's much like what it's like for us in the house as we've been going through this process. We had to make one area chaotic in order to fix another area. I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, so definitely one of the things that I tend to do that can be problematic is bite off more than I can chew. what I've found to be helpful in categorizing things in boxes or bins and labeling them is that then I can take those out one at a time and make a 1-hour project of it instead of taking everything out of the closet and flooding the room, because then I can't get in, I'm overwhelmed, I feel bad. It's the same amount of stuff, but it was hidden before. Now I pulled it all out because I was feeling awesome about doing it. And now I'm overwhelmed. So I like to take a little out at a time. If I'm feeling really ambitious, I still might take out more than I can handle in one session. But like you said, putting away things at the end of your sorting and discarding session, I think can be helpful too. Some people living in extremely small places say, you know, the people struggling using buried in treasures, it sounds luxurious. They have a home, they have a playroom, they have a kitchen, they have, you know, I don't even have a bathroom in my apartment. It's a single room occupancy. What do? I don't have a surface. So sometimes what we've done is set up a flat surface on their bed that we work on and then put things away again so that they can use the bed. So temporary staging areas can be helpful, but definitely not taking out more than I can work on at that time.
And the way we found out it was too much was unfortunately just in the experience of it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we started things with the best intentions, and then we had to figure out what was too much, what was over the balance point for us.
Yeah.
Great. Carol?
This question's for Lee, and I think also for Dr. Frost. I too am a peer provider. Thank you both for sharing your stories today. I also share the same diagnosis as bipolar, and I'm just curious, how is the relationship between the two for you?
Right.
Did you have to work on one and then the other? Does one trigger the other? How is that relationship? And also for Dr., do you think it's valuable for somebody to manage the mood disorder first and then move on to something else that also is affected by mood? I mean, I don't know. It sounds like if it were me, I'd just work on all of it at once just to try to get something going on.
That's so us. So I think, you know, what I found was actually a natural progression in my own recovery. I wasn't intending to do anything in one order or another. I started working on the sort of leveling out the bipolar ups and downs, and realized a big part of working on that was using my RAP. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Wellness Recovery Action Plan, copelandcenter.com is where you can learn more about it. And that's how I made the connection between the ups and downs in that part of my life and the ups and downs in the amount of stuff I was getting. So I realized that the same lessons I applied to dealing with my emotions, I could apply to dealing with the stuff too. So I actually, you know, and this is something that comes up, I had confidence in my recovery here because I had been through it big time, you know, and it's never really over, but over enough so that I can live with it, not after it, but with it. And then I was able to apply a lot of those same sort of lessons to the clutter. That's why I made the RAP for reducing clutter, so that other people could make that connection and maybe use those same tools. So I definitely felt that once, you know, because a lot of the collecting followed that experience, like Becca was saying, you know, you feel good, you go out and get stuff, you feel great, then you feel bad because you got it, so you go down. So what do? You get more to go back up. Well, if you're not going up so hard and down so hard, you don't need as many coping tools, and especially the unhealthy ones.
Yeah, and I would say that with bipolar disorder, the manic episodes are frequently associated with excessive acquisition. I mean, really, sometimes a way out there acquisition. So clearly, that you need to get control of that manic-y portion. With respect to the depression, we see, as I said, lots of depression in hoarding. But one of the things that we try to teach people is to work through the depression. That is, to keep going with the other things you need to do while you're depressed. It's a great way of treating the depression as well as working on the other stuff.
This is for the whole panel. Is there any correlation between a single person that's trying to work on decluttering their life and somebody who has family or loved ones involved in trying to help? Like, is one more successful than the other?
I think it's really easy to maintain your habits, as unhealthy as they are, if you're on your own. I think that when people have a family or people that are close to them, when they're not isolated, there is naturally more response around what they're doing and perhaps more motivation. It might be more difficult to come out if the person is so totally isolated and might not see reasons to come out of living that way.
We have time for one more.
In the data that we collected through our project, what we saw is that for households that have 2 adults and children, they were much more likely to come into compliance, complete the program, and stay in compliance long term when compared to other households. Single individuals did well if they had in-home support, case management working with them. The folks who struggled more seemed to be 2 unrelated adults or folks who are in sibling relationships, so brother and sister, for example, living together. Those folks did not do as well, and I can make some pretty good guesses about why that might be. So that's generally what we tend to see, but the in-home support seems to be a huge indicator for success over time for the folks that we see, at least. So.
And our data also show that that the hoarding problems are more severe if the person's living alone. And then the clutter tends to go up. And I talked about this a little bit at the breakout. There is, I believe, one and maybe only one true law of hoarding, of behavior, true law of behavior generally. And that is if someone is coming over to your house, what are you going to do? You're going to clean up. And that holds for people with hoarding problems and people who don't have hoarding problems. So one of the things we suggest to everyone when they get started in this, if they're living alone, have someone visit. They don't have to talk to you about the hoarding. They don't have to do anything, just a social visit, because that visit will make them motivated.
I think there's also, there are so many complicated dynamics. I've had people come to the group where, you know, the woman will say, my husband and I are both collectors, and he's really pissed that I'm here because he thinks I'm going to go home and put this all on him. How do I get better if he doesn't want to? So it's not necessarily that one person is desperately waiting for the other to get better. Sometimes it's more reinforced because they're both in it and doing it. And so it's very much like the way Becca and I work together, where she drew limits and where I'm saying to that person, you know, clearly define what's your stuff to work on and, you know, explain what you're doing and that this is your process. Take care of yourself, set those limits, but dealing with that anger, the anger that you would be going to a group to get help is counterintuitive to a lot of people to think that someone from the family is actually mad that you're going to get help for this, because then they worry that they're going to be left behind or something like that. But then there's the parents that'll say, my kids mess it up, I clean it up, but the kids mess it up. And that's why I think that there's so many ways to join together and work in partnership. So many parents say, I feel guilty because all I'm going to pass along are bad habits and clutter. Say, well, maybe there's an opportunity to start practicing some good skills together, and that will be your legacy. And so start now instead of feeling bad that it hasn't started yet. There's so many opportunities to turn things around.
Carolyn, you have one more.
Dr. Frost and probably the entire panel, bringing it back full circle, this program was funded today by the Social Service Block Grant in response to Superstorm Sandy. And in your estimate, do finders and keepers who lose everything suddenly have a greater crisis than those of the regular society that loses everything in the same disaster?
Before you answer that, I just want to say one comment. What we found is they haven't parted with their stuff. It's just wet and destroyed. So they still have their stuff. So I don't know if they've lost it yet. That's been part of our problem. Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess it's hard to answer that question. I have seen people who have lost all of their stuff and been okay with it. The worst scenario is when someone else takes their stuff. And there we see suicides, we see other kinds of real emotional trauma. And so it's a little hard to answer that question, just because that kind of naturalistic study it hasn't been done.
There's been sort of a dark fantasy that a lot of people have shared, which is, I wish my house would just burn down. I wish there would be a flood. I wish there would be a tornado. I wish it was all just gone so I didn't have to make all those decisions. Well, we had a tropical storm up in New England, which actually flooded the basements of some of the folks in the group. And suddenly they were devastated and realized that they had missed that opportunity to be almost like that slow-moving storm themselves, object by object, instead of everything at once. There was a much greater appreciation for the ownership of that process and the opportunity to take charge. So it was inspiring to some people. For those who lost everything, it was a moment of reckoning, and I don't know how they're doing. You know, that's really hard, but I think everybody responds in a different way. It's hard to say. It wasn't the fantasy they hoped for, that's for sure.
Anything else? Jamie, how are we on time? We good?
Yeah, I think we should wrap up.
Okay. Well, we want to thank again Dr. Frost, Lee, Rebecca, Jesse for coming here and sharing your information.
Thank you. Thank you.